Did you end up grabbing the groceries on your way home? What's that supposed to mean? What? You're asking me like I forgot again. No, I'm literally asking if you got the groceries. Right, because apparently I can't remember anything lately. I never said that. You don't have to. I can hear it in your tone. My tone? I asked a simple question. Because you always do this. You ask these simple little questions that are really criticisms. That's ridiculous. I was trying to figure out whether I need to get out and get the groceries or not. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about the groceries. One partner heard accusation inside of a relatively neutral question. The other partner now feels unfairly mischaracterized. Both people begin defending themselves against the emotional implications rather than responding to the actual conversation. Have you ever asked your partner what felt like a harmless question, only to watch the conversation turn tense, defensive, and emotionally charged? You weren't trying to start a fight. You weren't trying to criticize them, yet somehow your partner heard blame hidden beneath your words, reacted defensively, and before long, the conversation spiraled into conflict. Or perhaps you've been on the receiving end. Your partner asked you a question, or maybe they made a comment, and something inside of you tightened. You began reading between the lines, assigning their motives, sensing passive aggression from them, and feeling criticized. Even though part of you wasn't entirely certain that was their intention. So you defended yourself. Their reaction, they reacted to your defensiveness, and then you reacted to their reaction. And suddenly, both of you find yourselves arguing over emotional meanings, assumptions, and misinterpretations. As Byron Katie says, the quality of your relationships is determined less by what is said and more by the meanings you attach to what is said. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. In many relationships, couples not only simply are talking with one another, they're unconsciously communicating with the stories, fears, assumptions, and emotional conclusions connected to one another's words. Well, welcome to Mars Venus Coaching. I am your gender intelligence coach, Clay Smith. And in today's episode, we're going to explore one of the most common but destructive communication traps couples fall into. And that is the tendency to read into each other's words, assign meanings, react to the emotional intentions that may not actually be there. More importantly, by the end of the episode, you will have a clear framework for recognizing when this dynamic is happening in real time. We're also going to take a closer look at some strategies that you can implement for regulating your own responses more effectively, and how to create conversations that lead to greater understanding rather than deeper disconnection. Let's begin by first understanding what it actually means to read into things. Because most couples do this without even realizing they're doing it until the conversation begins unraveling. Now, for the sake of clarity, I'm going to use phrases like reading into things, or reading between the lines, or hearing more than what was said rather interchangeably. While both point to the same underlying concept, each phrase carries a slightly different emotional tone and may land differently depending on the context. When we talk about reading into things, We're talking about the tendency to hear more than what is actually being said. One person asks a relatively neutral question, makes a simple observation, or expresses a concern, but the other person unconsciously assigns additional meanings beneath their words. Instead of only hearing the sentence itself, they begin hearing implication, criticism, judgment, disappointment, control, or passive aggression. Even if none of those things were consciously intended by their partner. For example, a question like, "Did you get the groceries?" may not register as a practical inquiry. It can quickly become interpreted as, "You're irresponsible. You forgot again. I can't rely on you. You never help out." In many relationships, the emotional reaction is not actually being triggered by the words alone. It's caused by the meanings a person has attached to those words. This is why two people can walk away from the exact same conversation with two completely different experiences. One person feels like they simply asked a question. The other person feels criticized, ambushed, or emotionally attacked. And once these emotional interpretations take hold, defensiveness follows quickly. The conversation stops becoming about each other and starts becoming about self-protection, counter-defense, and emotional survival. Now, once you begin recognizing this pattern, it becomes much easier to know why this dynamic can create increased tension. If couples are constantly hearing criticism and disappointment or blame, beneath relatively neutral conversations, emotional safety slowly begins to erode. Small discussions become emotionally loaded. Observations start sounding defensive. Simple questions begin feeling dangerous. Now, if this dynamic creates so much misunderstanding and defensiveness and disconnection, why do people do this in the first place? Why do human beings so often hear more than what is actually being said? This process often happens automatically without even conscious awareness. Most people aren't intentionally twisting their partner's words. They're reacting to an internal alarm system. This system is constantly scanning for signs of disrespect, criticism, or control. This becomes even more pronounced because human beings naturally filter present conversations through past relational experiences. If one partner has previously communicated through sarcasm, criticism, or passive aggressive remarks, or even just subtle emotional cues, the mind begins anticipating those patterns before the conversation has even fully unfolded. In other words, people are not only listening to the current conversation, they're also listening to the memory of previous conversations. The mind begins connecting the dots, predicting meanings, and preparing for emotional impact based off of past experiences. So when someone asks a relatively neutral question in the present moment, the nervous system may unconsciously attach emotional significance from the past onto the current interaction. They stop responding to what is actually being said and start reacting to what similar moments have meant before. At a basic survival level, the brain is designed to predict danger before it happens. In a relationship, emotional danger can feel like criticism, rejection, abandonment, disrespect, control, or feeling like a failure. So when they are hearing more than what is being said, essentially they're not trying to be difficult here. The nervous system is trying to protect them from being hurt again. The problem becomes when this protective system becomes overactive. That means the very system designed to protect the relationship can accidentally damage the relationship when it reacts too quickly, too defensively, or too suspiciously. One reason women may more likely hear more than what is being said is because women often process communication through a highly interconnected way. Research indicates that women generally have a larger corpus callosum, the connective tissue connecting the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere of the brain. The left hemisphere is associated more with logic, language, facts, where the right hemisphere is more associated with emotion, intuition, memory, and relational awareness. As a result, communication is often processed through multiple channels simultaneously. A woman may not only hear the literal sentence itself, she may also register tone, facial expression, emotional energy, previous experiences, relational context, subtle implications, and overall how the interaction feels in the moment. This is why a relatively neutral question can sometimes carry deeper emotional meanings. If similar comments in the past were associated with criticism, emotional distance, or just feeling misunderstood, her brain makes those connections almost automatically. Now you know why relationships are so messy. In many cases, the reaction isn't simply about the words themselves. It's about what the words appear to signal about the relationship. Questions can now begin feeling less like requests for information and more like indicators for disapproval. At a deeper level, women are often highly attuned to emotional connection and relational security. So when communication starts to feel emotionally off, even subtly, her nervous system begins to search for any hidden meanings in an attempt to protect connection and emotional safety. For this reason, it's wise to reserve emotionally charged conversations for an in-person dynamic. I explore this more closely in a previous episode entitled Talk Over Text, where we unpack why couples are so prone to misinterpreting each other's meanings behind a screen. Without the body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, and emotional context, even a well-intended message can be taken in a completely different way. I'll include a link for that video in the description below. Now, men tend to read into things for an entirely different reason. In many cases, men tend to process communication more literally, directly, and maybe more solution-oriented. Because of this, they may initially focus more on the factual content of the conversation rather than the emotional layers surrounding it. However, when a man already feels criticized, unappreciated, or emotionally inadequate, even a relatively neutral question can carry unintended implications beneath the surface. A friendly reminder may start sounding like, "You can't be trusted, you're failing again, you're never enough, I have to babysit you." This is especially true because many men carry deep emotional needs surrounding acceptance, trust, appreciation, and competence. When those needs feel threatened, The nervous system quickly interprets questions or observations or repeated reminders as evidence that they are falling short in the eyes of their partner. For example, a question like, "Did you remember to call the insurance company?" may no longer register as a logistical prompt. It might begin feeling like surveillance, micromanagement, or even subtle criticism regarding his reliability or responsibility. As a result, many men become defensive, not necessarily because of the words themselves, but because of what the words appear to imply about how the relationship, how their partner sees them. In that moment, the conversation stops feeling like collaboration and starts feeling like an evaluation. His interpretation is often filtered through previous relational experiences as well. If past interactions repeatedly carried criticism or correction or just a perceived lack of appreciation, his brain begins anticipating those emotional meanings before the conversation has fully unfolded. While women often hear potential threats surrounding emotional connection and relational security, men more often hear potential threats surrounding trust, acceptance, and personal inadequacy. When you begin understanding these differences, you can see why so many couples walk away from that exact conversation feeling misunderstood, frustrated, and emotionally disconnected. Very often, neither of them intended harm. Both people were simply filtering their interaction through different emotional needs, relational sensitivities, and internal interpretations. A woman may hear emotional disconnection where a man intended practicality. A man may hear criticism or distrust where a woman intended concern or collaboration. And because both people believe that they are reacting to something real, defensiveness can feel completely justified in the moment. Let's now explore 5 of the most significant effects, what I like to call relational casualties, this dynamic creates over time. When couples repeatedly communicate through assumptions, defensiveness, and emotional interpretations, the impact extends beyond a single conversation. I would say the most damaging aspect of this dynamic is that emotional reactivity is highly contagious. When one partner misinterprets a neutral question and responds defensively, the originally neutral partner often responds or reacts defensively as well. Stress is contagious like that. And we often mirror our partner's stress without even realizing it. Now, at this point, the conversation can quickly transform into a negative feedback loop. One partner reacts to perceived criticism, the other reacts and gets defensive, and now both nervous systems begin escalating each other. Ironically, the reactive response from the originally neutral partner now is evidence that justifies the first person's emotional interpretation. See, I knew this was upsetting you. I knew you were criticizing me. I just knew something was wrong. This is the reason emotionally charged conversations spiral so quickly. The relationship stops operating through clarity and begins operating through emotional contagion, assumptions, and nervous system reactivity. One of the first casualties, relational casualties out of this dynamic is the demise of emotional safety. Neutral conversations begin feeling emotionally risky because we no longer know how our words will be interpreted. Over time, couples can become increasingly guarded, careful, or tense around each other, constantly monitoring their tone, their words, their facial expressions, their delivery, just in an attempt to avoid any and all conflict. This often creates what many couples call walking on eggshells, where even a simple conversation starts feeling emotionally loaded and unpredictable. If you'd like a deeper understanding of how this dynamic develops, how it harms connection, and how couples can begin rebuilding that emotional safety again, I'd encourage you to check out one of my classic episodes entitled Walking on Eggshells. I'll leave a link for that video as well. The second relational casualty of reading into things is that defensiveness slowly becomes the default communication style. Instead of listening to understand each other, both partners begin listening to protect themselves from criticism, judgment, rejection, or misunderstanding. As a result, observations start sounding like an attack. Explanations start feeling argumentative. Conversations become less about connection and more about self-protection. This is something I expand on in one of my other episodes entitled The First Act of War, where we discuss how defensiveness quietly damages emotional connection, how to recognize it in real time, and how couples can replace that defensiveness with healthier forms of communication. It's an oldie, but a goodie. The third casualty of reading into things is that couples stop asking, "What did you mean by that?" And they start saying, "I know what you meant." This causes motives to be assigned rather than clarified. The fourth relational casualty of reading into things is that trust and goodwill begin to shrink. One partner feels constantly misinterpreted while the other feels emotionally unsafe or dismissed. And over time, both begin giving each other less of a benefit of the doubt. Finally, the fifth relational casualty of reading into things is that little misunderstandings become bigger conflicts, thus taking longer for couples to find that reconnection. As I previously mentioned, these arguments escalate quickly because both partners are reacting to the perceived meanings rather than the actual words being exchanged. Eventually, even repair attempts can feel suspicious or inadequate. When couples consistently fall into this trap of reading into things or hearing more than what was said, it's obvious that communication slowly becomes shaped through assumption rather than understanding. Emotional safety begins to erode. Defensiveness becomes more automatic, and trust and goodwill start shrinking. Little misunderstandings can quickly grow into larger conflicts that make it even more difficult to repair. Well, the encouraging reality, however, is that this pattern can be interrupted. Couples can learn how to slow the conversation down, challenge their own assumptions, observe meaning before reacting emotionally, and communicate in ways that create greater understanding. Let's now take a look and focus our attention on the solution side of the conversation. We're going to explore what each partner can begin doing to escape this trap and create healthy, more emotionally intelligent communication. When you find yourself reading into things, here are some behavior changes you can implement to avoid these relational casualties from keeping you and your partner disconnected. First of all, slow down your interpretations. One of the healthiest things a person can do is to separate out what was actually said with the meaning I immediately attached to it. Before reacting emotionally, ask yourself, what did my partner literally say? Versus, what am I assuming they meant? 2, become curious before getting defensive. Instead of immediately defending yourself, learn to explore the meaning of what they said first. Some examples might sound like, what did you mean by that? Help me understand what you were trying to say. I may be interpreting this wrong. Was that your intention? Curiosity slows emotional regulation and creates space for clarity. Another thing to implement is to recognize when the past is entering the present. Sometimes that emotional reaction is less about the current moment and more about previous experiences attached to similar conversations. A powerful question then becomes, am I reacting to this moment, or am I also reacting to previous pain, criticism, or tension? Awareness alone can dramatically reduce unnecessary escalation. Another thing to try is to stop automatically assigning motives. One of the quickest ways to damage communication is assuming that you already know your partner's intention. Instead of imagining that they criticized you, or they don't trust you, or they don't make you a priority, or they're just judging you, learn to mentally replace that certainty with possibility. Maybe that is what they meant. Maybe it isn't. This keeps the nervous system regulated and the conversation open. Another thing you can implement is to listen out for your partner's positive intention and not just the emotional implications. Many couples become so focused on emotional implications that they stop considering their partner's positive intent altogether. This doesn't mean ignoring hurtful comments. It means deciding emotional awareness with relational generosity. Could my partner simply be just asking me a question? Could they be trying to connect rather than attack? Healthy communication requires giving each other enough benefit of the doubt to seek clarification before getting escalated. Learn to regulate before responding. The moment you feel emotionally activated, your interpretations become far less reliable. When the nervous system feels threatened, the brain naturally begins searching for danger, criticism, rejection, and disrespect. This is why those emotionally charged conversations can distort your perception. Sometimes the healthiest things you can do is pause, breathe, regulate your body, slow the interaction down before responding emotionally. Another thing to try is to reflect back what you heard. Another powerful tool is just checking out your interpretation before reacting to it. Some examples would be, so what I'm hearing is, let's see, clarification. Or it sounds like you mean, or maybe, are you saying, ask for clarification. This allows your partner to observe misunderstandings before the conversation spirals out of control. And notice my tone with those 3 phrases. Was it argumentative and defensive? Or was it curious? Lastly, remember that misinterpretation is a human tendency. The goal is not perfection. Healthy couples still occasionally misinterpret and misunderstand each other. The goal is becoming more aware of when you hear more than what was actually said. Learning how to slow things down, creating conversations centered around clarity, understanding, while preserving that emotional safety. Everything we've talked about so far is focused on what you can do to avoid reading in between the lines. But relationships involve two people. So, what happens when you're communicating clearly, your intentions are good, and your partner still hears something that you never meant? Let's take a look at some practical ways to respond when they hear more than what was said. The first practical way to respond is to lead by example. One of the most powerful things you can do is to refuse to mirror their defensiveness. Couples naturally influence each other's nervous system, and if your partner becomes reactive, you become reactive in return, the conversation is just going to escalate quickly. But when you stay calm, curious, grounded, and give the relationship a different pattern to follow, over time your partner may begin to see the benefit of your changed communication style and feel more encouraged to do the same. This does not mean tolerating disrespect or pretending nothing bothered you. It simply means choosing to model the kind of communication style that you want to implement and to be implemented in your interaction with your partner. Another way to respond is to recognize that when your partner begins reading into things, their nervous system is already on high alert. It's in those moments that interruptions, defensiveness, and emotional narratives tend to surface. In that moment, one of the most mature things that you can do is resist the urge to interrupt them for interrupting you. If you correct their interruption too quickly, the conversation will shift into another layer of defensiveness. Instead, pause the original conversation. Take enough time to hear what they believe you said. Help them feel understood first, and then gently guide the conversation back to what you were actually trying to say. You might say, let me slow this down for a second. I can see how this may have landed differently than I intended. What I was trying to say was, finish your thought. This allows you to examine that emotional interpretation without abandoning the original purpose of the conversation. Another practical way to respond is to use clean communication. While we never are responsible for how another person interprets things, we are responsible for communicating as clearly as we can. If our communication is filled with sarcasm, passive-aggressive comments, hidden agendas, rhetorical questions, vague hints, or just the expectation that our partner should just know what we want, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to separate our actual words with possible hidden meanings. The cleaner the communication, the less guesswork our partner has to do. And whenever possible, say what you mean. Ask directly for what you want or need, and avoid communicating through criticism, implications, or emotional games. Clean communication is not only about how clearly you speak, it's also about how responsibly you respond when someone else communicates unclearly. If your partner hints, implies, makes vague comments, hoping you'll just know what they want, the healthiest response is to not take the bait. You take the bait when you read in between the lines, defend yourself, or automatically change your behavior based on what you assume they meant. Instead, gently invite clarity. You might say, I want to understand and I don't want to assume. What you're asking from me is, and make sure you're on the same page. This keeps you from rewarding indirect communication while also giving your partner an opportunity to express their wants and needs or requests more cleanly. Over time, this helps both people practice more honest, direct, and emotional safe conversation. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about this communication style, I cover it in a much deeper detail in one of my other episodes called Clean Communication. I explain practical ways couples can express themselves with greater clarity, honesty, and keeping that emotional safety intact. I'll leave a link in the description box below with the others. Now, if you struggle communicating with a partner who reads into things, cuts you off mid-sentence, and gets defensive, one of the simplest ways to reduce misunderstandings is to reveal your intention before revealing your message. The reason people read into things is because the brain is naturally trying to answer a question that hasn't yet been addressed, and that is, why are you bringing this up? If you don't answer that question, your partner's mind may try and answer it for you. And if they're already feeling stressed or hurt or emotionally not safe, they may assume the worst. So instead of beginning with your question itself, begin with your purpose. For example, instead of asking, hey, did you get the groceries? You might ask, I'm trying to figure out whether I need to stop by the store on my way home from work. Did you happen to pick up the groceries today? Or instead of asking, did you remember to call the insurance company? You might say, I'm trying to figure out what we still need to do on our to-do list. Did you happen to check in with the insurance company today? Notice, the questions don't really change. What changed was the context. When people understand your motives, they spend less energy trying to interpret your intentions and more energy listening to your actual words. Here are a few phrases that could help you reveal your motive before revealing your message. I'm just curious. Help me understand. I want to be sure that I'm hearing you correctly. I'm only asking because I want to be on the same page. This isn't a criticism. I just want to understand. My goal is not to blame you. I'm trying to solve this with you. Think about these as setting the stage for the conversation to begin. These phrases aren't a guarantee your partner's not going to read into things, but they do make it much easier for them to hear your actual meaning rather than guessing what they think you meant. Sometimes the most effective communication doesn't begin with the message. It begins with the motive behind the message. Sometimes a conversation is a lot like opening up a 1,000-piece puzzle. As you begin explaining an idea, you're essentially laying down pieces on the table. But before you've had a chance to place all of the important pieces out on the table, your partner starts predicting what the completed picture is going to be like. The problem is that it's incredibly difficult to accurately identify a 1,000-piece puzzle when you've only got a handful of pieces that you're looking at. The fewer the pieces you have, the more you're going to misinterpret the final result. Because most of us naturally do this under stress, it can be helpful to prepare your partner before introducing a, a complex topic to them. You might say, hey babe, I've got several pieces that I want to lay out first. I'd like to really get those out there, and then I want to hear your perspective before we put all the pieces together. Does that work for you? Or hang with me just for another minute. I think the next few pieces will give us a bigger picture of what's going on. Bringing your partner the roadmap ahead of time helps reduce the tendency to fill in the gaps too early. And if your partner begins interrupting and drawing conclusions before you're finished, gently bring them back to the conversation as you unload more pieces of the puzzle. Remember, the fewer pieces we have, the more the imagination has to fill in the gaps. At the beginning of today's episode, we watched how a simple question about the groceries turned into an argument that had a very little to do with groceries themselves. Two good people who found themselves defending against the meanings that neither of them intentionally created. The encouraging news is that this pattern is not permanent. The next time you find yourself reading in between the lines or hearing more than what your partner actually said, pause. Ask yourself, am I reacting to what they said or to the story my mind has created beneath what they said? And if you notice your partner beginning to read in between the lines, remember that you have more of an influence than you realize. Lead by example. Use clean communication. Reveal your motive before your message. Give the conversation enough time to unpack the pieces before you make the broader picture known. Because healthy relationships are not built by couples who never misunderstand each other. They are built by couples who learn how to recognize misunderstanding early. Slow things down. Replace assumptions with curiosity, defensiveness with understanding, and reaction with intentional communication. The truth is, your partner doesn't need perfect communication to thrive. It simply needs two people who are willing to become students of each other instead of judges of each other. So this week, I want to leave you with a simple challenge. Choose just one idea from today's episode and intentionally practice it in your next meaningful conversation. Maybe it's just asking more clarifying questions before reacting. Maybe it's revealing your motive before your message. Maybe it's allowing the puzzle pieces to fully laid out before deciding what the complete picture is going to be. Small changes. Practice consistency. Create remarkable transformation over time. Now, if you found this episode to be helpful, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button. Be sure to subscribe to my channel on a regular basis. I send out relationship tools designed to strengthen connection. Be sure to check out all those other episodes I referenced in today's show. I know I mentioned a lot, and that was intentional. This relationship tool kind of builds on each other. And as you develop the skills in the previous episodes, we're able to build a bigger picture here. And if today's episode helped you realize the pattern in your own relationship, but you're not quite sure how to break that cycle, I'd love to help. Sometimes the hardest communication patterns to recognize are the ones that we're standing in. When you are emotionally invested in a relationship, it's difficult to objectively see your own patterns, assumptions, communication patterns that might keep pulling the two of you back into that old argumentative habits. During a complementary clarity call, we'll explore the communication dynamics that are unique to your relationship. Identify where these patterns keep showing up and discuss practical tools and a personalized checklist to help replace misunderstanding with understanding, defensiveness with emotional safety, and reoccurring conflict with healthy communication. If that sounds like something you'd like to pursue and take that next step, I'd love to connect with you. You can book a clarity call in the link below in the description box. Let's stay connected because the more you understand what your partner meant, instead of reacting to what you assumed, the more emotional safety, trust, and connection can be built one conversation at a time.